When she collapsed, her 5-year-old dialed a random number crying, "My mommy fainted." The child had no idea she had just called the billionaire father, who never knew she existed. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories, your own family channel. May the Almighty bless every woman with a peace that softens every wound, a strength that rises even in silence, and a love so pure it lights every corner of her home. May her steps be guided by mercy, her nights be wrapped in comfort, and her days overflow with joy she truly deserves. May her heart never break without healing, may her tears never fall without purpose, and may every prayer she whispers return to her multiplied in blessings. Women are the gentle warriors of this world. Your patience, your dignity, your grace keep generations standing tall, my beautiful family. I see many of you watching, staying quiet. Tell me, have you forgotten your brother, Mr. Peter? Or do you think my words do not reach your heart anymore? Speak to me. I promise I will reply to every comment because you are my family and your voice matters to me. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." The phone rang in the middle of the acquisition meeting, a number Jack Nicholson hadn't seen in years, flashing across the screen of his private line that only 3 people in the world possessed. He almost declined it. The board members around the mahogany table were staring, waiting for him to continue his presentation on VisionNet's expansion into Asian markets. $15 billion hung in the balance, but something made him answer. "Hello?" The voice that came through was small, trembling, and absolutely terrified. "My mommy collapsed. She won't wake up. I'm scared." Jack's blood turned to ice. The child couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, her words tumbling out between sobs. "Sweetie, where are you? What's your address?" "I don't know the numbers, but there's a red door and a big tree outside. Mommy said never call anyone, but this broke the glass thing." The glass thing. An emergency. Jack's mind raced through the possibilities of how a child had his private number, and then the small voice said something that made his heart stop completely. "Mommy's name is Jean Mantegna. She teach me how to say it." The room tilted. Jean. The woman he'd spent one perfect month with 6 years ago, before his mother had given him an ultimatum and he'd chosen his inheritance over everything else. The woman whose calls he'd ignored until they stopped coming. The woman he'd deliberately looked past at his TechCrunch interview, because acknowledging her would have meant acknowledging what he'd done. "Stay on the phone with me," Jack said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting in his chest. "Can you see anything else? Any street signs?" The little girl was crying harder now. "I'm scared. Mommy's on the floor and she's really still." Jack was already standing, grabbing his coat. His assistant looked alarmed. The board members were confused. He didn't care. "I'm coming to help your mommy right now. You're being so brave. What's your name?" "Rosie." The name hit him like a freight train. He'd suggested that name once, lying in bed with Jean, talking about hypothetical futures neither of them had believed would disappear so completely. "Rosie, I need you to tell me what you see out the window." Through her frightened descriptions, Jack pieced together the address. He knew that neighborhood. He'd walked those streets with Jean, memorized the way to her apartment because he'd been planning to surprise her with keys to a bigger place. That was before his mother had shown him exactly what his trust fund clause stipulated and what staying with Jean would cost him. He was in his car before Rosie finished describing the coffee shop on the corner. His security team scrambled to follow. He broke every speed limit, his heart hammering against his ribs, this tiny voice on the phone the only thing keeping him tethered to sanity. When he reached the building, he took the stairs 3 at a time. The door was unlocked, just like Rosie had said after he'd walked her through opening it. And there, in the modest living room that looked exactly like Jean would have made it, warm and filled with books and artwork, was Jean herself. She was on the floor beside her desk, unconscious but breathing. And standing in the doorway to what must have been her bedroom was a little girl with Jean's eyes and his own stubborn jawline, clutching a phone with a cracked screen. "You came," Rosie whispered. Jack dropped to his knees beside Jean, checking her pulse with shaking hands. It was strong, steady. He called for an ambulance, then looked back at Rosie. "You did exactly the right thing. You saved your mommy." Rosie walked forward slowly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like he was being dissected. "You sound like you know her." "I do, a long time ago. She talks about someone sometimes. When she thinks I'm asleep, she sounds sad." The ambulance arrived before Jack could respond. Paramedics filled the small apartment with efficient chaos. Jean stirred as they checked her vitals, her eyes fluttering open in confusion. The moment she focused and saw Jack's face, that confusion transformed into something sharp and devastating. "Get out!" Her voice was hoarse but venomous. "Get away from me!" "Ma'am, you need to stay still," one of the paramedics said gently. "I'm fine. I just fainted. Low blood pressure. Happens when I work too many hours." Jean tried to sit up, her eyes never leaving Jack. "What are you doing in my home?" "Your daughter called me. You collapsed." Jean's gaze snapped to Rosie, then to the old phone in her daughter's hand, then back to Jack. The color that had been returning to her face drained away again. No, Rosie, baby, where did you find that phone?" "In your desk drawer, under the papers. You said if there's ever a real emergency, find a phone and call someone." Rosie's voice got smaller. "Was that wrong?" "You're not wrong, sweetheart. You were perfect." Jean's words were tender for her daughter, but when she looked back at Jack, her expression could have cut glass. "But he needs to leave. Right now." The paramedics exchanged glances. "Ma'am, we really think you should come to the hospital. Get checked out properly. You'll need someone to watch your daughter while we run tests." "I'll call my friend Keisha. She'll come." "I can stay with Rosie," Jack said. "Absolutely not." One of the paramedics crouched down to Jean's eye level. "Dr. Mantegna, I recognize you from Memorial. You know better than anyone that fainting isn't something to ignore, and you know you need someone with your daughter. We can't leave her here alone while we wait for your friend." Rosie had moved closer to Jack without anyone noticing. She'd taken his hand. When Jean saw it, something in her face broke in a way that was worse than any anger. "He came when I called," Rosie said softly. "Nobody ever comes that fast, not even you when you're at the hospital." Jean closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Fine, he can ride in the ambulance. But when Keisha gets there, you disappear. You got one phone call in 6 years, Jack. Don't expect another." As they loaded Jean onto the stretcher, Rosie squeezed Jack's hand tighter. "Are you my daddy?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Every paramedic froze. Jean's sharp intake of breath was the only sound. Jack looked at this little girl, this perfect little girl with his eyes and Jean's beautiful face, and felt the weight of 6 years of cowardice settle onto his shoulders like concrete. "Yes," he said, "I think I am." Jean turned her face away, but not before he saw a single tear slide down her cheek. Chapter 2. The life he walked away from Memorial Hospital's emergency department was controlled chaos. But the moment the ambulance doors opened with Jean on the stretcher, something shifted in the air like everyone had been holding their breath. Nurses appeared from everywhere. A doctor Jack didn't recognize immediately took command, barking orders with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. But what struck Jack was the way everyone looked at Jean, not with pity, with respect that bordered on reverence. "Dr. Mantegna, what happened?" A young resident rushed over, her face tight with concern. "I'm fine, Torres, just overworked. Tell Dr. Okafor I'll be back on the schedule tomorrow." "With respect, doctor, you're getting a full workup whether you like it or not." The attending physician was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and an immovable stance. "You've been pushing too hard for too long, we all know it. Time to face facts." Jack stood to the side, still holding Rosie's hand, watching this unfold. The little girl pressed against his leg, overwhelmed by the bright lights and rapid movement. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" Rosie whispered. "She's going to be fine. These people really care about her. Everybody loves Mommy. She saves people." Before Jack could respond, a woman in a sharp suit, and an expression that could freeze hellfire appeared in the waiting room. She was tall, dark-skinned, and looked at Jack like he was something unpleasant she'd discovered on her shoe. "Get away from that child." Her voice was low and dangerous. "Right now. You must be Keisha, and you must be the coward who abandoned Jean when she needed you most." Keisha moved between Jack and Rosie with the precision of someone trained in protection. "Come here, baby girl, come to Auntie Keisha." Rosie looked uncertain, but he came when I was scared. He came really fast. "I know, sweetheart, but he needs to leave now. Your mama wants him to go." "Why?" It was such a simple question, such an impossible question. Keisha's jaw tightened. "Because sometimes grown-ups make really bad choices, and your mama doesn't want to be around someone who hurt her." "Did he hurt her like when I fall and scrape my knee?" "Worse than that, baby. Much worse." Jack felt like he was watching his own execution. Rosie's confused face, Keisha's righteous fury, and somewhere beyond the emergency room doors, Jean was being examined by doctors who looked at her like she hung the moon. "I'd like to stay until we know she's okay," Jack said quietly. Keisha pulled an envelope from her bag and thrust it at him. "Cease and desist. You come near Jean or Rosie again without permission, and I'll bury you in legal paperwork so deep you'll need a team of lawyers just to find daylight. Are we clear? I just want to know she's all right." "You lost the right to care about her well-being when you changed your phone number and pretended she didn't exist." Keisha's voice dropped even lower. "I was there, Jack. I was there when she called me crying because you wouldn't answer. I was there when she showed up to your public events, standing in crowds, hoping you'd see her. I was there when she finally stopped trying. So no, you don't get to walk back into her life because of one emergency phone call." Rosie tugged on Keisha's sleeve. "But he said he's my daddy." Keisha closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were filled with pain. "Did your mama tell you that?" "No, but I asked him and he said yes." "That's something you need to talk about with your mama, not with him." The attending physician appeared in the doorway, his expression serious. "Ms. Jackson, Dr. Mantegna is asking for you, and for her daughter." Keisha nodded, then looked at Jack one final time. "You have 5 seconds to walk out that door before I call security. Don't make me count." Jack looked down at Rosie. She was holding on to Keisha now, but her eyes were still on him, wide, confused, waiting for him to do something. "Can I come visit sometime?" Jack asked her, "to make sure your mommy is okay?" Rosie looked up at Keisha. "Can he?" "That's up to your mama, sweetheart. Not me, not him, your mama." Jack nodded slowly. He started to turn away, then stopped. "Rosie, you were incredibly brave today. Your mommy is lucky to have you. Are you coming back?" The question was so hopeful, it shattered something in his chest. "I'd like to, if your mommy says it's okay." "She won't," Keisha said flatly. "Now leave." Jack walked out of the hospital into the cold night air, his hands shaking, his mind replaying the look on Jean's face when she'd seen him, the tear that had fallen, the way she'd turned away like the sight of him was unbearable. He got into his car and just sat there. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, his board members, his mother. He ignored all of them. Instead, he pulled up Jean's name in his old contacts, the one he'd blocked years ago, and stared at it. Then he did something he should have done 6 years ago. He called his lawyer. "I need you to file paperwork for paternity testing and establish visitation rights. I have a daughter. Her name is Rosie. She's 5 years old." His lawyer was silent for a long moment. "Jack, do you understand what you're opening up here? This will become public. Your company's stock will take a hit. Your reputation will be affected." "I don't care. She called me for help and I'm not walking away again. File the paperwork." As he hung up, he realized what he'd just done. He'd started a war, and Jean was going to fight him with everything she had. But in that hospital waiting room, looking at a little girl who had his eyes, he'd felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Purpose. And he wasn't letting go of it this time. Not for anyone. Not for anything. Not even for the fortune his mother still controlled or the empire he'd built on the backs of choices he regretted every single day. Chapter 3. The Custody Trap. The letter arrived at Jean's apartment 4 days after she'd been discharged from the hospital with a diagnosis that made her blood run cold and her entire world feel like it was constructed on sand. Autoimmune disorder, chronic, manageable but serious. She needed to reduce her hours, reduce her stress, and start treatment that would make her too weak to perform surgeries for months. She'd thrown the medical recommendations in the trash. She was chief of emergency medicine. She had residents to train, patients who needed her, a reputation she'd built from absolutely nothing. She didn't have time to be weak. And now this letter, this legal bomb that Keisha was reading aloud in Jean's living room, while Rosie played with her dinosaurs in the next room, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. He's filed for paternity testing and formal visitation rights. Keisha's voice was carefully controlled, but Jean could hear the fury underneath. He's claiming he only recently discovered Rosie's existence and wants to establish a relationship with his daughter. Jean laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound that didn't belong in her throat. Recently discovered, as if I didn't try to tell him, as if I didn't stand outside his office building for 3 hours once, waiting to catch him, only to have security escort me away like I was some kind of stalker. I know, we'll fight this, but Jean, you need to understand something. He has resources, unlimited resources. He can drag this out for years, make it expensive, make it exhausting. So what are you saying? Keisha set the papers down carefully, like they might explode if handled wrong. I'm saying he's going to argue that he didn't know, and proving that you tried to contact him 6 years ago is going to be difficult. You called his phone numbers. They were disconnected. You sent emails. They probably went to spam or were deleted by an assistant. You showed up at events. But did you ever formally serve him with paternity notification? Did you ever go through legal channels? Jean felt sick. The nausea from her medication mixed with the rage in her stomach until she couldn't tell which was which. I was pregnant and terrified. I didn't know about legal channels. I just knew the man I'd been with, the man who'd told me he was falling in love with me, suddenly wanted nothing to do with me. I believe you, but a judge might see a successful businessman who claims he was never informed and a mother who kept his child from him for 5 years. I didn't keep Rosie from him. He wasn't there to be kept from. I know that, you know that, but his lawyers are going to paint a different picture. Keisha leaned forward, her expression intense. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he's going to get visitation, maybe even partial custody. Jan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the city moved on like her world wasn't crumbling, like everything she'd built alone wasn't being threatened by a man who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with her heart, let alone her daughter's. He doesn't get to do this. He doesn't get to show up because Rosie called him one time and suddenly play father. He gave up that right. Legally, it doesn't work that way. Then the law is broken. Rosie appeared in the doorway, clutching her favorite stuffed triceratops, her eyes too perceptive for a child who should still believe the world was safe. Mommy, why are you upset? Jan immediately smoothed her expression, pulling on the mask she'd perfected over years of hiding her pain. I'm not upset, baby. Just talking with Auntie Keisha about grown-up stuff. Is it about my daddy? The words hit Jean like a physical blow. Rosie had never called anyone that before, had never asked about her father. Jean had built their life so completely, so carefully that the absence hadn't seemed to matter, until it did. Rosie, come here. Jean sat back down and pulled her daughter into her lap. Remember how we talked about how families come in all different kinds? Some have mommies and daddies, some have 2 mommies, some have 2 daddies, some have just 1 parent. And we're the kind with just a mommy, I know, but now we have a daddy too. He told me. Jean looked at Keisha helplessly. Keisha's expression was sympathetic but firm. This conversation was Jean's to have. It's more complicated than that, sweetheart. Just because someone is related to you doesn't mean they're part of your family. But he came when I was scared, and he was nice, and he has my eyes. I saw it in the mirror. Jung wanted to scream. She wanted to tell her daughter that the man with her eyes was a coward who'd abandoned them when it mattered most. But Rosie was 5. She didn't understand betrayal or abandonment, or the way some people could look at you like you were their entire world and then walk away like you'd never existed. I know he came when you were scared, and I'm grateful he did, but that doesn't mean he gets to be part of our lives now. Why not? Because he wasn't there before. He wasn't there when you were born. He wasn't there for your first steps or your first words or any of your birthdays. He wasn't there when you had the flu and we spent all night in the emergency room. He wasn't there. Rosie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice so small it barely qualified as sound, "Did he not want to be there?" And there it was. The question Jean had been dreading for 5 years, the question that had kept her awake on every one of Rosie's birthdays, wondering how to explain that her daughter's father had chosen his bank account over her existence. I don't know what he wanted, baby. I just know what he did, and what he did was leave. But he's here now. For how long? The words came out more bitter than Jean intended. What happens when things get hard, Rosie? What happens when being your father isn't exciting anymore? What happens when he gets bored? Rosie didn't answer. She just hugged her triceratops tighter. After Jean put Rosie to bed that night, she found Keisha still in the living room, reviewing the legal documents with the intensity of someone preparing for war. You need to make a decision, Keisha said without looking up. You can fight this. Spend years in court. Spend a fortune on lawyers, and maybe keep him away from Rosie. Or you can negotiate, control the terms, supervised visitation, limited hours, your turf, your rules. I don't want to negotiate with him. I know. But think about Rosie. She's already curious about him, already asking questions. If you fight this too hard, if you keep her from him completely, she's going to grow up wondering, and when she's older, she's going to resent you for it. Jean closed her eyes. I hate that you're right. I'm a lawyer. Being right is literally my job. Keisha's voice softened. He hurt you. I know that. I was there for all of it. But this isn't about you and him anymore. It's about Rosie and what's best for her. What's best for her is not having a father who's going to disappoint her. Maybe. Or maybe what's best for her is the chance to know him and decide for herself. Keisha stood up, gathering her papers. I'll draft a proposal. Supervised visitation, once a week, 2 hours, with a child psychologist present. He wants to be her father. He can prove it. On your terms. After Keisha left, Jean walked into Rosie's room. Her daughter was asleep, clutching that stuffed triceratops, her face peaceful in a way Jean's heart hadn't been for days. She'd built them a good life, a strong life, a life where Rosie had everything she needed and most of what she wanted, a life where Jean's absence of a partner hadn't translated into Rosie's absence of love. But looking at her daughter now, she could see Jack in the curve of her eyebrows, the shape of her hands, the stubborn set of her jaw, even in sleep. Rosie was half him, whether Jean liked it or not. And now he wanted back in. Jean pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead and whispered the promise she'd made the day Rosie was born. I will protect you, no matter what, even from him, especially from him. Chapter 4. The health crisis escalates. The call came during a surgery that Jean had no business performing, her hands trembling slightly as she held instruments that could save or destroy a life with the smallest mistake. She'd been on her feet for 14 hours. The autoimmune disorder her doctors had diagnosed was getting worse, not better, and she was ignoring every single recommendation they'd given her because stopping meant admitting weakness. And Jean didn't do weakness, couldn't do weakness. Not when she'd built everything alone. Dr. Mantegna, are you all right? Her surgical resident was staring at her with concern that bordered on alarm. Jean realized she'd been standing completely still for several seconds, staring at the patient's open abdomen while the tremor in her hands intensified. She could barely grip the scalpel without her fingers spasming. I'm fine. Continue with the sutures. Doctor, maybe you should... I said I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. The world tilted slightly. The bright surgical light seemed too bright, too harsh, burning into her retinas. And then her pager went off with an emergency code that made her heart stop completely. Rosie's school. Jean's heart stopped. She looked at her resident, saw the fear in the young woman's eyes, and made a decision that went against every instinct she had. Someone take over, now! She was out of the operating room before anyone could argue, scrubbing out with shaking hands that refused to cooperate, her mind racing through every horrible possibility. Rosie hurt, Rosie sick, Rosie missing, Rosie dead. The school nurse's voice on the phone was calm but serious. Dr. Mantegna, Rosie is fine physically, but she had a bit of an incident today. She got very upset during recess and said her stomach hurt. We think it might be anxiety related. Can you come pick her up? Anxiety. Rosie had never had anxiety before. Rosie was the happiest, most well-adjusted 5-year-old Jean had ever known, the one bright spot in Jean's carefully controlled chaos. Except now her world was being turned upside down by a father who'd appeared out of nowhere, and a mother who was barely holding herself together with medication and sheer stubbornness. Jean drove to the school, still in her scrubs with someone else's blood on her shoes, and found Rosie sitting in the nurse's office with red-rimmed eyes and a paleness that made Jean's doctor instincts scream. "Mommy!" Rosie launched herself into Jean's arms with a desperation that broke something in Jean's chest. "My tummy hurts." "I know, baby. Let's get you home." In the car, Rosie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Maya's daddy came to career day today. He's a firefighter. He brought his hat and let us try it on. He showed us pictures of fires he put out." Jean's hands tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. "That sounds fun." "I told my teacher my daddy is a billionaire. She asked if he was coming. I said I didn't know where he was." Rosie's voice got smaller. "She asked if I was sure I had a daddy. Some kids laughed." And there it was. The real stomachache. The real anxiety. The real pain of being 5 years old and having to explain why your father didn't exist in any meaningful way. When they got home, Jean held Rosie on the couch and tried to find words that wouldn't break her daughter's heart any more than it was already breaking. "Your daddy and I are figuring things out right now. It's complicated. Is he coming to my birthday?" Jean's birthday was in 3 weeks. Jean had already planned everything. The dinosaur theme Rosie loved. The cake shaped like a triceratops. The party at the Natural History Museum with all of Rosie's friends from school. The perfect day for her perfect daughter. "I don't know, sweetheart. Can you ask him?" Jean closed her eyes. "Maybe." That night, after Rosie was asleep, Jean collapsed on her bathroom floor. The tremors that had started during surgery hadn't stopped. Her joints ached like someone had taken a hammer to every bone in her body. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, beyond anything medication could fix. She pulled out her phone and stared at the medical report her doctor had sent, the treatment options, the medications that would help but would also mean she couldn't perform surgeries for months. The very real possibility that if she didn't start treatment soon, the damage might become permanent, irreversible, career-ending. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number that somehow she knew was Jack. "I'd like to see Rosie. Supervised. Whatever terms you want, please." Jean stared at the message. She should delete it. She should block the number. She should maintain the wall she'd built around herself and her daughter, the fortress that had kept them safe from disappointment. But Rosie's words echoed in her head. "Is he coming to my birthday?" Jean typed back with fingers that shook. "Supervised visitation, once a week, 2 hours, with a child psychologist present, my apartment, my rules, break any of them and you're done." The response came immediately. "Thank you, I'll be there." "When?" "Saturday, 2 p.m. Don't be late." She threw her phone across the bathroom and let herself cry. For the first time since Jack had walked back into her life, she let herself feel the full weight of her fury and her fear and her absolute terror that he was going to hurt her daughter the way he'd hurt her. The next morning, Jean's colleagues staged an intervention that felt more like an ambush. 5 of her fellow doctors cornered her in the conference room before her shift started. They'd brought her medical files, her recent lab work, her deteriorating vitals that painted a picture of someone spiraling. "You're killing yourself," her closest colleague, Dr. Okafor, said bluntly, "and we're not going to let you." "I'm fine. You collapsed during a surgery yesterday. You left a patient open on the table. Don't lie to us and don't lie to yourself." Jean wanted to argue, but looking at their faces, at the genuine concern and frustration and something that looked like fear, she couldn't find the words. "I can't stop working. I have a daughter, I have bills, I have a life that depends on me being strong." "You can't be strong if you're dead." Dr. Okafor pushed the treatment plan across the table. 3 months, that's all we're asking. 3 months of treatment. Let your body heal. Let us carry the weight for once. I don't know how to not work. Then learn, because if you don't, you're not going to be here to watch your daughter grow up. You're not going to see her graduate. You're not going to walk her down the aisle. You're going to be dead. Is that what you want? The words hit harder than any diagnosis. Jean looked down at the treatment plan. The medications, the reduced schedule, the terrifying vulnerability of admitting she needed help, of being less than perfect, of being human. "I'll think about it." "Don't think. Do. We start Monday." That evening, Jean got another text from Jack. "I've been doing some research. Your autoimmune disorder. There's a specialist in Boston, best in the country. I'd like to cover the consultation and any treatment costs. No strings." Jean stared at the message with something close to hatred burning in her chest. Of course he'd found out about her medical condition. Of course he had resources to throw at problems like money could solve everything. Of course he thought wealth could fix what he'd broken. She typed back, "I don't want your money. I don't need your help. I've been managing without you for years. I'll continue managing. I know you don't need me, but maybe let me help anyway. Not for you, for Rosie." Jean threw her phone again. This time it cracked against the wall, a spider web of damage spreading across the screen. Rosie appeared in the doorway, clutching her triceratops, her small face creased with worry. "Why are you mad at your phone?" Jean took a shaky breath. "I'm not mad at my phone. I'm just tired, baby. The kind of tired where you need a hug." Jean felt tears prick her eyes. "Yeah, that kind of tired." Rosie climbed into her lap, all warmth and unconditional love, and Jean held her daughter and wondered how she was supposed to let Jack Nicholson anywhere near this perfect child when all she wanted to do was protect Rosie from ever feeling the kind of pain Jean felt every time she looked at him. Chapter 5. The scandal breaks. Jean found out about the media leak while she was in the middle of explaining dinosaur extinction to Rosie over breakfast, trying to make sense of why some species survived and others didn't, which felt like a metaphor for her entire life. Her phone exploded with notifications, text messages, emails, calls from numbers she didn't recognize flooding in like a digital avalanche. Keisha's name flashing on the screen with an urgency that made Jean's stomach drop to somewhere around her knees. "Don't look at the news," Keisha said the moment Jean answered, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Don't look at anything. I'm coming over right now." "What happened?" "Someone leaked the story. You, Jack, and Rosie. It's everywhere. Every major outlet, every gossip site, every news channel. It's a feeding frenzy." Jean felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Rosie, who was happily arranging her plastic dinosaurs in a line on the table, completely unaware that their private nightmare had just become public entertainment for millions of strangers. "How bad?" "Bad. The headlines are brutal. You need to prepare yourself, and you need to keep Rosie away from any screens." After Keisha arrived and Jean had sent Rosie to play in her room with promises of ice cream later, she finally looked at her phone. The headlines made her physically ill, bile rising in her throat. Billionaire Jack Nicholson's secret love child revealed. Tech mogul abandoned pregnant black surgeon. VisionNet CEO has illegitimate daughter he never knew existed. The articles were worse. They dug up photos of Jack from 6 years ago, young and successful and completely unattached in public records. Photos of Jean from medical conferences where she'd been building her career while pregnant and alone. They'd interviewed hospital staff who had no business talking to reporters, people she'd trusted who'd sold her privacy for what she assumed was money. They'd even found Jean's apartment building and taken pictures of the entrance, of Rosie's school, of the coffee shop where Jean got her morning caffeine fix. "They're calling me his baby mama," Jean said, her voice hollow. "I'm a chief of emergency medicine. I've saved hundreds of lives. I've published research that changed trauma protocols in hospitals across the country. I've trained dozens of surgeons who are now saving lives themselves, and they're reducing me to a baby mama." Keisha looked murderous, her lawyer face fully engaged. "The hospital's PR team is handling it. They're releasing a statement supporting you. But Jean, you need to stay away from the hospital for a few days. The reporters are camped outside like vultures. I have surgery scheduled. They'll find coverage. Right now, you need to focus on protecting Rosie from this circus." As if summoned by her name, Rosie appeared in the doorway, her small face confused. "Mummy, there are people outside with cameras. They wanted to take my picture. I didn't let them because you said never talk to strangers." Jean's blood turned to ice. She moved to the window and looked down at the street below. Sure enough, a cluster of photographers had gathered on the sidewalk, their cameras pointed at her building like weapons, waiting for a shot of the woman who'd been stupid enough to trust a billionaire. "We need to leave," Keisha said immediately, already pulling out her phone. "Come to my place. They don't know where I live yet. We have maybe an hour before they find out." Jean was moving on autopilot, throwing clothes into a bag for herself and Rosie, her mind barely processing what was happening. This was supposed to be private, their pain, their history, their complicated situation. Now it was entertainment for millions of strangers who'd judge her without knowing anything about what really happened. Her phone rang, Jack's name on the screen like an accusation. She almost didn't answer, but Keisha nodded, indicating she should, and Jean put it on speaker with hands that wanted to throw the device out the window. "I'm sorry." Jack's voice was rough, like he'd been awake for days, screaming into the void. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how they found out, but I'm handling it." "Handling it?" "Jack, there are photographers outside my apartment. Rosie is terrified. My career is being dragged through the mud. How exactly are you handling this?" "I've hired security for you. They should be there any minute. I've also contacted every major outlet with a cease and desist regarding any photos of Rosie. Minors can't be photographed without permission. I've got 3 law firms working on this." "You think that's going to stop them?" "It's a start. Jean, please, let me help. Let me fix this." "You've helped enough." Jean ended the call before he could respond, but within minutes, a security team did arrive. Professional, discreet. They helped Jean and Keisha get Rosie out of the building through a back entrance and into a waiting car with tinted windows that felt like a cage. At Keisha's apartment, Jean finally let herself fall apart. Rosie was watching cartoons in the other room, and Jean sat on Keisha's bathroom floor and sobbed into her hands with a violence that scared her. "He did this," she whispered between gasps for air. "He came back into my life and destroyed everything. Everything I built, everything I protected. Gone. The nurse who leaked it will be fired," Keisha said quietly from the doorway. "The hospital is investigating. But Jean, the damage is done. You can either hide from this, or you can control the narrative." "How do I control something like this?" "You tell your story, an interview, your terms. You show people who you really are. Not his baby mama, Dr. Jean Mantegna, chief of emergency medicine, single mother, survivor who built a life from nothing." Jean wiped her eyes. I can't talk about him publicly. I can't talk about what he did without falling apart. Then he wins. Then the story is whatever the media wants it to be. Is that what you want?" Jean's phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Jack had released a public statement that everyone was already dissecting. She read it with Keisha looking over her shoulder, both of them silent. I take full responsibility for my absence from my daughter's life. 6 years ago, I made a choice driven by cowardice and selfishness. Dr. John Mantegna is one of the strongest people I've ever known. She built a life for herself and our daughter without any support from me. She didn't keep Rosie from me. I failed to be there. I failed them both. I'm working now to correct that failure, not because of this media attention, but because my daughter deserves a father who shows up. I deeply regret the pain I've caused. Jean stared at the words until they blurred together. Part of her wanted to believe them. Part of her wanted to throw her phone across the room again and watch it shatter into pieces as small as her trust. He's protecting you, Keisha said quietly. He's taking the blame publicly. That's something. He should. It's his fault. I know, but most men in his position would have their PR team spin this differently. They'd make excuses, blame you, paint themselves as the victim who didn't know. He's not doing that. So what? He gets credit for telling the truth, for admitting what he did. That's the bare minimum of human decency. No. But it means something that he's not making this worse than it already is. Jean didn't respond. She couldn't, because somewhere underneath her fury and her hurt, there was a tiny, traitorous part of her that was relieved Jack wasn't throwing her to the wolves, that he was at least taking responsibility publicly, even if it changed nothing about what he'd done. But relief wasn't trust, and public statements weren't accountability. And words on a screen weren't the same as showing up consistently day after day after day. 3 days later, when the media frenzy had died down slightly, and Jan felt safe returning to her apartment with the security team Jack had hired still stationed outside, she found a letter slipped under her door. It was from Jack's mother. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant, expensive, the kind that came from boarding schools and country clubs. Jean opened it with shaking hands and read words that made her blood boil with a rage so pure it felt cleansing. Dr. Mantegna, I'm sure you're aware that my son has made an unfortunate mistake in acknowledging your child publicly. I'm writing to offer you a solution that benefits everyone involved, $5 million. In exchange, you and the child relocate out of state. Preferably out of the country. You sign a non-disclosure agreement. You never contact my son again. You never speak to the media. You disappear from our lives completely. I think you'll find this is a generous offer given the circumstances. My family has worked too hard to build our reputation to have it destroyed by this situation. I trust you'll make the right decision for everyone, especially for your daughter who deserves better than being a scandal. Call my attorney to arrange the details. Jean read the letter 3 times, each reading making her angrier than the last. Then she called Keisha with hands that wanted to strangle someone. Record everything, Keisha said immediately, her lawyer instincts kicking into overdrive. Every interaction with his family, every offer, every threat, this is going to matter in court. She called Rosie the child, not my granddaughter, not Rosie, not even her name, the child, like she's a problem to be solved with money. I know, and we're going to make sure Jack knows exactly what kind of family he comes from, exactly what they think of his daughter. Jean took a photo of the letter and sent it to Jack with a single message. This is your mother. This is your family. This is what you come from. You think you're different? Prove it, because right now you're just another rich man who thinks money fixes everything. Chapter 6. The Sacrifice. No one sees. Jack received Jean's text while sitting in his empty penthouse that suddenly felt like a mausoleum, staring at the city lights below and wondering when his entire life had become something he didn't recognize in the mirror. His fiancée had left him 3 days after the scandal broke. His mother had publicly disowned him in a statement that made national news. His company's stock had dropped significantly enough that his board was in open revolt. And now, looking at the photo of his mother's letter on his phone screen, he felt something inside him break completely into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The child. His mother had called Rosie the child like she was an inconvenience. A problem to be solved with money and legal documents, a stain on the family reputation that needed to be scrubbed away. Jack had grown up in that world. A world where people were commodities to be bought and sold, where relationships were transactions with expected returns on investment, where love was conditional on maintaining the right image, the right connections, the right bank balance in the right accounts. He'd thought he'd escaped it when he'd built VisionNet from nothing, when he'd proven he could make his own fortune without the family money funding his dreams. But he'd been fooling himself. He'd used his mother's threats about the trust fund as an excuse to abandon Jean. He'd chosen money over love because that's what his family did. He'd become exactly what his mother had raised him to be, a coward with a good credit score and empty eyes. He called his lawyer immediately, not caring that it was past midnight. "I want to know who leaked the story to the media. Spare no expense. Find out who did this." It took 2 days and a team of private investigators. The answer made him physically sick, bile rising in his throat. His mother had paid the hospital nurse to leak the information. She'd orchestrated the entire media circus, hoping the public humiliation would force Jack to abandon Jean and Rosie again, hoping it would make the situation go away quietly, like all the other situations the family had faced over the decades. Jack sat with this information for hours, staring at the evidence his investigators had compiled: bank transfers from his mother's personal account, text messages between her and the nurse, a paper trail that proved premeditation. Then he made a series of decisions that would change everything and everyone he'd been pretending to be. First, he stepped down as CEO of VisionNet. The announcement shocked the business world. The board erupted in chaos. But Jack didn't care anymore. He couldn't run a company built on connection and community when his own life was falling apart because he'd valued profit over people, money over meaning. Second, he announced that VisionNet would restructure completely under new leadership: age verification for users under 18, mental health resources integrated into the platform, algorithm changes to reduce addictive features that his team had spent years perfecting, everything his board had resisted for years because it would hurt their bottom line and their quarterly earnings reports. His net worth dropped by billions overnight. The news called it corporate suicide. His former colleagues called it insanity. His mother called it betrayal. Jack called it penance that was long overdue. He didn't tell Jean any of this, didn't make public statements about his choices or his reasons, just quietly dismantled the empire he'd built and walked away from the person he'd been for his entire adult life. Meanwhile, he kept showing up for the supervised visits with Rosie like they were the most important appointments of his existence. Every Saturday, 2 p.m., exactly on time. Never early, never late, understanding that consistency mattered more than grand gestures. The child psychologist, Dr. Sarah Lynn, was professional but clearly skeptical of his intentions. She watched Jack like a hawk, taking notes on every interaction, every word, every gesture, building a case for or against him in her careful documentation. The first visit was awkward. Rosie was shy around this man who was suddenly her father. Jack didn't know how to talk to a 5-year-old without sounding condescending. They sat in Jean's living room with Dr. Lynn between them like a referee at a boxing match, and Jack felt more nervous than he'd ever felt in any boardroom or investor meeting. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Jack asked, because Rosie was clutching her stuffed triceratops like it was the only stable thing in her universe. "They're my favorite. Mommy took me to the museum and we saw real fossils. Some of them were bigger than cars." "Which dinosaur is your favorite?" "Triceratops, because they protected their babies from the T-Rex. The mommy ones were really brave. They'd fight anything to keep their babies safe." Jack felt that comment land like an arrow straight through his chest. Of course, Rosie's favorite dinosaur was the one that protected its young. Of course, that's what resonated with a child whose mother had been fighting alone for 5 years. "Your mommy is very brave," Jack said quietly, meaning every word. "She's one of the bravest people I know." Rosie studied him seriously with eyes that were too much like his own. "Did you make her sad?" Dr. Lynn looked at Jack with interest, clearly not expecting such direct questioning from a 5-year-old. But Rosie was sharp, observant, too smart for her own good. "Yes," Jack said. refusing to lie or sugarcoat. I made her very sad, and I'm sorry for that. Did you say sorry to her? I've tried, but sorry isn't always enough. Sometimes you hurt someone so badly that sorry doesn't fix it. Sorry is just words. Rosie thought about this with the seriousness of someone much older. When I hit Maya at school, I had to say sorry and not play with her toys for a week. Maybe you should not play with Mommy's toys. Jack couldn't help but smile despite the weight in his chest. That's very wise. What if I don't play with any toys and just try to be better? That might work, but it takes a long time. When I was mean to Maya, she didn't trust me again until I shared my snacks for a whole month. Every single day. How long do you think your mommy needs? Rosie looked at him with devastating honesty. Maybe forever. You made her cry on my birthdays. That's really bad. The visits continued week after week, Jack showing up with the consistency of someone trying to prove he understood how time worked, how reliability built trust slowly. He learned that Rosie loved dinosaurs but was afraid of the dark, that she wanted to be a doctor like her mommy, that she was learning to read and was very proud of herself for finishing chapter books, that she asked questions that made Jack's heart hurt, because they were so innocent and so cutting at the same time. Why didn't you come before? Did you know Mommy was having a baby? Do you have other kids you like better? Jack answered every question honestly, understanding that lies would poison whatever foundation they were trying to build. Dr. Lin seemed surprised by this approach. Most parents in his position would deflect, make excuses, paint themselves as victims. But Jack was done with excuses. I knew about you. I was scared of what it would mean. I made a terrible choice based on money. No, I don't have other kids. I only have you. And I wish I'd been braver sooner. Jean watched these sessions through a one-way window that Dr. Lin had suggested. A way for Jean to see the interactions without influencing them, without her presence changing Rosie's behavior or Jack's responses. She saw Jack's patience when Rosie ignored him to play with her toys, his genuine interest when Rosie explained the difference between herbivores and carnivores with enthusiasm, the way he listened when Rosie talked about her school day like it was the most important thing in the world. She also saw the moments when he looked devastated, when Rosie asked hard questions about his absence, when she mentioned Jean with obvious adoration, when she talked about birthday parties and doctor's appointments and school plays that Jack had missed and could never get back. After 8 weeks of consistent visits, Dr. Lin pulled Jean aside with an assessment that Jean didn't want to hear. He's good with her. I don't say that lightly. Most absent parents who suddenly show up are performative. They try too hard. They make big promises they can't keep. They're more interested in looking like good parents than being good parents. Jack is different. He's present. He's honest. He's not trying to be her hero. He's just trying to be there. Jean didn't want to hear this confirmation of what she'd been seeing. She wanted Dr. Lin to confirm that Jack was terrible, that he was going to fail, that Jean's instinct to protect Rosie from him was correct and justified. It's been 8 weeks. That doesn't erase 6 years of nothing. I know. But it's a start, and consistency over time matters more than any grand gesture could. That night, Jean received a notification on her phone, a transfer of $50,000 into her bank account, a note attached from Jack. For Rosie's education fund, or medical expenses, or whatever you need, no strings attached, no expectations. Jean immediately tried to return it, her fingers angry on her phone screen, but the transfer was set up in a way that made it impossible to send back without accepting it first, some kind of legal structure that trapped the money. She called him, furious, her voice shaking. I told you, I don't want your money. I know, but Rosie deserves it anyway. I've missed 5 birthdays, 5 Christmases, 60 months of her life. This doesn't come close to making up for that, but it's something. It's what I should have been doing all along. This feels like you're trying to buy your way in, like you think money can fix what you broke. I'm not. I'm trying to be responsible for once in my life. Take it. Don't take it. Give it to charity if you hate where it came from. I don't care what you do with it, but I'm going to keep sending it every month because that's what fathers are supposed to do. support their children financially even when they've failed them in every other way. Jean hung up on him before she said something she'd regret, but she didn't return the money. Instead, she put it in a college fund for Rosie and tried to ignore the tiny part of her that was starting to believe he might actually mean what he said, might actually be capable of change. Chapter 7. The Discovery. Jean's surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. sharp. High risk, but necessary. Her autoimmune disorder had progressed to the point where her doctors weren't giving her a choice anymore, where the word emergency had started appearing in her medical files. The night before, Rosie cried herself to sleep, asking if Mommy was going to die, her small body shaking with sobs that broke Jean's heart into pieces she didn't know how to reassemble. Jean had no legal family to name as emergency guardian if something went wrong during the surgery. Her parents were gone, killed in a car accident years ago. She had no siblings. Her closest friends were professional colleagues, not people she'd burden with her daughter's future if the worst happened. Except there was someone now. Someone who'd shown up every Saturday for 3 months without fail, without excuse. Someone who'd sent money every month even though Jean had asked him not to, had told him explicitly she didn't want his financial support. Someone who answered every call when Rosie wanted to talk about dinosaurs or school or absolutely nothing in particular. She hated that the someone was Jack, hated it with every fiber of her being. Keisha had suggested letting Jack take Rosie during the surgery recovery period. Jean had almost fired her as a friend for suggesting something so impossible, but then Dr. Lin had weighed in with her professional assessment. Rosie has bonded with him over these months, forcing separation now, especially during a time when she's already anxious about your surgery and terrified of losing you, could be genuinely traumatic. Sometimes what's best for the child isn't what feels best to the parent. So Jean found herself standing in her living room on Monday evening, giving Jack instructions, while Rosie packed her overnight bag with more stuffed animals than clothes, her small hands shaking. She goes to bed at 8, no exceptions, even if she begs to stay up. She needs her nightlight or she has panic attacks. She has bad dreams sometimes about dinosaurs chasing her, which is ironic given how much she loves them during the day. When she wakes up scared, you sit with her until she falls back asleep. You don't leave her alone in the dark. Ever. "I won't leave," Jack said, writing everything down like he was studying for the most important test of his life. "She's allergic to strawberries. It's mild, but you still can't give her any. Check every label. She's picky about vegetables, but she'll eat them if you let her dip them in ranch dressing. She needs to practice her reading every day, 20 minutes minimum. There are books on her shelf marked with sticky notes." Jack was writing everything down in neat handwriting, his expression completely focused. "She'll ask about me constantly. Be honest about where I am. Tell her I'm in the hospital but I'm okay. Don't make promises you can't keep about when I'll be home. Don't lie to her about anything." "I understand." Jean looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time since he'd come back. He looked tired, older than he had 3 months ago. His clothes were expensive but rumpled like he'd been sleeping in them. His hair needed a cut. He looked like someone who'd been doing the hardest work of his life and wasn't sure he was doing it right. "If anything happens to me during the surgery, nothing is going to happen to you. But if it does, there are legal documents in my desk. Instructions for Rosie. Money set aside in accounts with her name. Keisha has copies of everything. You don't get to make decisions about her life just because you're here now. Do you understand that?" "I understand." Rosie appeared with her backpack that was definitely too full, stuffed with dinosaurs and books and what looked like half her bedroom. "I'm ready." Jean crouched down to her daughter's level, ignoring the pain in her joints. "You're going to stay with your daddy while Mommy has her surgery. Auntie Keisha will check on you, and I'll be home before you know it." "Promise?" Jean wanted to promise with everything in her, wanted to guarantee that she'd survive the surgery and come home and everything would go back to normal. But she was a doctor. She knew the risks. She knew the statistics. She knew that sometimes people didn't come home. "I promise I'm going to fight really hard to come home to you, harder than I've ever fought for anything." Rosie threw her arms around Jean's neck and squeezed hard enough to hurt, hard enough to bruise. "I love you, Mommy. You're the best mommy in the whole world." "I love you too, baby. So much it doesn't fit in words." When they left, Jean stood at her window and watched Jack help Rosie into his car with careful hands. He was gentle with her backpack, patient when she couldn't get her seatbelt fastened. He made sure everything was secure. He didn't drive away until Rosie waved up at Jean's window one final time. Keisha appeared beside her at the window. "He's going to be okay with her." "How do you know?" "Because he's terrified, and people who are terrified of failing don't take things for granted." The surgery went well from a technical standpoint, but the recovery was brutal in ways Jean hadn't anticipated. She woke up in pain that medication barely touched, disoriented from anesthesia and desperately needing to see her daughter with an urgency that bordered on panic. Keisha was there immediately, her hand cool on Jean's forehead. "Rosie is fine, better than fine. Jack has been sending updates every 2 hours like clockwork. She's eating, sleeping in her own bed. He took her to school and picked her up on time. They've been reading together every night. She's okay, Jean, you can rest. I need to see her. Tomorrow, when you're stronger and not falling apart. Right now you need to rest and heal." But Jean couldn't rest. Something felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. Not physically wrong. Something else. Something that made her skin crawl. She asked Keisha to bring her laptop from home, to pull up her personal files, and there, in a folder she'd forgotten she'd created 6 years ago when everything had fallen apart, was her journal from the worst period of her life. She'd left it in her desk drawer, the same desk drawer where Rosie had found the old phone, the drawer Jack had access to while staying with Rosie in Jean's apartment. Jean opened the journal with shaking hands that had nothing to do with surgery and read her own words from 6 years ago, words she'd written when she thought she'd never have to see them again. "Called Jack again today. Number disconnected. I'm 12 weeks pregnant now. Starting to show. Bought maternity clothes I can't afford. I showed up at his office building, but security escorted me out. They treated me like I was crazy. Maybe I am. Maybe I imagined everything between us. Maybe I meant nothing to him and everything to me. 20 weeks. I can feel the baby moving constantly now, little flutters that make me cry. I keep thinking Jack would want to know, would want to feel this miracle. But he's gone, completely gone. I saw him on the news today talking about his company's success. He looked happy, triumphant, like nothing had changed, like I never existed in his world. 32 weeks. Mom and Dad were in a car accident today. They're both gone, both dead. I'm alone in ways I didn't know were possible. I went into early labor from the stress and grief. The baby is in the NICU, 3 pounds. So tiny and fragile. I sit beside her incubator and pump milk and cry until nurses worry I'm dehydrated. I named her Rosie, the name Jack suggested once when we were being stupid and optimistic. I don't know why I chose it. Maybe because I wanted him to be part of this, even though he's not. She has his eyes. I wonder if she'll hate me for that someday. Jean closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. She'd left it out on purpose. She'd known Jack would find it while staying in her apartment. Some part of her had wanted him to see what he'd done, the devastation he'd caused, the life he'd destroyed with his cowardice. 3 days later, when Jean was finally discharged and returned home with stitches and pain medication and instructions to rest, Jack was in her kitchen cooking dinner with Rosie, the two of them moving around each other with an ease that made Jean's chest tight. "Mummy!" Rosie ran to her carefully, mindful of Jean's stitches and bandages. "Daddy made mac and cheese. It's really good. He makes it different than you, but I like both ways." Jack looked up from the stove. His eyes were red and swollen, like he'd been crying. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, like he'd been sitting vigil waiting for Jean to come home. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, sore, alive." "Good, that's good." His voice was rough, broken in places. "Rosie, why don't you go put your toys away before dinner? Make sure all the dinosaurs are in their bin." When Rosie left the room with obvious reluctance, Jack turned off the stove and faced Jean with an expression she couldn't read. "I found your journal. I know. I read it. I shouldn't have invaded your privacy like that. But I did. And Jean, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. For leaving you to bury your parents alone, for not being there when Rosie was in the NICU fighting for her life, for missing everything that mattered, for being so selfish and cowardly that I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Jean felt tears burn behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "Sorry doesn't fix it. I know, but I'm saying it anyway, and I'm going to keep saying it, and I'm going to keep showing up, because that's all I can do now. Show up and hope it's enough." Jean didn't respond. She just walked past him to her bedroom and closed the door and let herself cry for everything she'd lost and everything that could never be repaired no matter how many times he apologized. Chapter 8. The Hidden Truth. Jack had been staying in a hotel near Jean's apartment for 2 weeks, showing up every morning to help with Rosie before school and every evening to help with dinner and bedtime routines that he was slowly learning through trial and error. Jean had stopped arguing about it because she was too weak from surgery recovery to fight, and truthfully, watching him interact with Rosie was harder than any surgery she'd ever performed. Her daughter was bonding with this man in ways that terrified Jean. Rosie laughed at his jokes, asked him questions about his day, wanted him to read her bedtime stories in the voice he'd developed for each dinosaur character. That's what made everything worse. Watching her daughter bond with the man who'd abandoned them. Watching Rosie light up when Jack arrived each day. Watching her perfect little life expand to include a father who didn't deserve her love or trust. But then Jean discovered something that shattered the fragile peace they'd been building like glass under a hammer. She'd been organizing Rosie's school papers when she found a drawing tucked into her daughter's backpack, clearly meant to be hidden or forgotten. A family drawn in crayon, mother, father, daughter, all holding hands with smiles that looked permanent, the words, "My family," written in Rosie's careful handwriting across the top, with hearts decorating the borders. Jean stared at the drawing until the figures blurred together. Rosie saw them as a family now, complete, whole, permanent, as if the 6 years of absence had been erased by 3 months of consistent presence and mac and cheese dinners. That night, after Rosie was asleep with her nightlight glowing, Jean confronted Jack in the kitchen where he was washing dishes with the methodical attention he brought to everything involving Rosie. "She drew us as a family." Jack turned around, drying his hands on a towel. "I saw it. She showed me yesterday. She was very proud of it." "We're not a family, Jack. You showing up for a few months doesn't make us a family. I know that. I never said—" "She doesn't know that. She's 5. She sees you here every day and thinks this is permanent. What happens when you leave? When you decide this is too hard or too boring or not worth your time? I'm not leaving. You said that before. 6 years ago, you said a lot of things. You said you were falling in love with me. You said you wanted a future with me. And then you disappeared like I was nothing." Jack flinched visibly. "I was different then." "Were you? Or are you just better at performing now? You've lost some money and some status and suddenly you're father of the year. What happens when you get bored of playing house, when the novelty of having a daughter wears off? This isn't a novelty. She's my daughter. I love her. She was your daughter 6 years ago, too. That didn't seem to matter when your mother threatened your trust fund." They stared at each other across the kitchen. The tension was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. All the words they'd been avoiding for months suddenly filling the space between them like poison gas. "I can't do this," Jean said finally, her voice breaking. "I can't pretend you're suddenly someone different. I can't watch Rosie fall in love with you when I know how this ends." "How does it end?" "With her heart broken. With me picking up the pieces of her shattered trust. With you moving on to whatever comes next in your life. That's what you do, Jack. You move on." "I'm not moving on. I'm staying right here." "Until what? Until it gets hard? Until someone offers you something better? Until your family pressures you to come back to their world and their money?" Jack's expression darkened with something like anger. My family is toxic. My mother tried to pay you to disappear. She called Rosie the child like she was garbage. Did you forget that? No, I remember perfectly. I also remember that she's still your mother. That blood is thicker than water, that eventually you're going to choose them over us, just like you did before when it mattered. I'm not that person anymore. Prove it then. Stop talking about being different and actually prove it. The challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but Jean's phone rang with an unknown number that she almost ignored. She answered out of habit, her doctor voice automatic and professional. Hello? Dr. Mantegna, this is Victor Kane. I'm calling about Jack Nicholson. The voice was smooth, confident, dangerous in its politeness. Jean's blood went cold. She knew that name. Jack's former mentor. The man who'd taken over as CEO when Jack stepped down from VisionNet. What about him? I have a business proposition, one I think Jack would be very interested in. But I wanted to run it by you first, as a courtesy to the mother of his child. I'm not interested in your business propositions, not even one worth $50 billion to your daughter's future. Jean's hand tightened on the phone until her knuckles went white. What are you talking about? VisionNet is being sold to an international conglomerate. As the founder, Jack stands to receive a substantial payout, $8 billion, enough to secure his daughter's future forever. Your future, enough to fund your hospital programs for decades, cure diseases, change the world. I'm sure you can see the appeal. What's the catch? Smart woman, I like that. The catch is simple and non-negotiable. Jack needs to relocate to Shanghai for integration with the new ownership. 18 months minimum, possibly longer depending on the transition. The contracts need to be signed in 30 days. I wanted you to know so you could encourage him to accept. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. And you think I'd encourage him to leave my daughter? I think you're practical. $8 billion buys a lot of forgiveness, a lot of security, a lot of opportunities for Rosie. Jean hung up without another word. Her hands were shaking with rage. She looked at Jack, who was watching her with concern that looked genuine. That was Victor Kane. He says you have an offer, $8 billion. Shanghai for 18 months minimum. Jack's face went carefully blank in a way that told Jean everything. I'm not taking it. He seemed to think you were considering it seriously. I'm not. Have you rejected it officially? Signed papers saying you won't take it? Jack hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for Jean's world to crack open again. You're still thinking about it, Jean said flatly, her voice dead. You're weighing your options, $8 billion versus staying here with Rosie, with us. I'm not weighing anything, I'm not taking the deal, I already know that. But you haven't said no. Not officially, not in writing. Which means some part of you is still deciding, some part of you is still that man who chose money over me when I was pregnant and alone. That's not fair. Fair? You want to talk about fair? Jean's voice was rising, years of buried rage finally breaking through. Rosie's birthday is in 30 days, the exact same deadline as your contract. Are you going to be here for her birthday or on a plane to Shanghai counting your billions? I'm going to be here, I promise you. Prove it, sign the rejection, right now. Show me you're not still choosing money over us. I need to talk to my lawyers first. Make sure I'm not violating any existing agreements or, there it is, you're still thinking about it, you're still leaving yourself an out, an escape route. Jack ran his hands through his hair in frustration. That's not what I'm doing. Then what are you doing? Because from where I'm standing, history is about to repeat itself exactly. Before Jack could respond, Jean's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email, from an anonymous sender with no subject line. She opened it, and her world exploded into pieces she'd never be able to put back together. It was a series of forwarded emails, internal correspondence from 6 years ago, Jack's work email, his assistant's responses, and there, in black and white, was proof that destroyed everything Jean had been trying to believe. Jean's best friend Keisha had reached out to Jack's office when Jean was pregnant, had sent formal notification that Jean was trying to contact him urgently, had explained that it was a personal emergency. Jack's response, forwarded from his assistant with his explicit approval: "Tell her I can't deal with this right now. My mother will disown me if I pursue this relationship. I've worked too hard to throw it away on a relationship that was never serious. Change my number, block all her attempts to contact me. I need to focus on the business. This is a distraction I don't need." Another email, dated a week later when Jean had tried reaching him through his company's main line. "Is the situation handled?" "Good. I can't have distractions right now. Series B funding is too important. My future depends on this round." And the worst one, the email that made Jean want to vomit, dated the exact day Rosie was in the NICU fighting for her life, while Jean sat beside the incubator alone. "Confirmed lunch meeting for Thursday. Looking forward to celebrating the funding round. This year is going to be incredible. Nothing can stop us now." Jean read the emails 3 times, each reading making her feel more numb. Then she looked at Jack with eyes that held nothing but contempt. "You knew. Your assistant told you I was trying to reach you, told you it was urgent. You knew I was pregnant, and you told them to make me go away, to block me, to erase me." Jack had gone pale, his face the color of ash. "Jean, you called me a distraction. You called our daughter a situation to be handled. You weren't confused or scared or unaware. You were cruel, calculated. You made a deliberate choice based on money. I was a different person then. No, you were this person, the person standing here right now, the person who still hasn't rejected the Shanghai offer, the person who's still weighing $8 billion against his daughter's birthday." "That's not true. I'm not." "Then why haven't you signed the rejection? Why are you still talking to lawyers about it? Why are you still leaving yourself options?" Jack had no answer that would satisfy her, no words that could undo what she'd just read. Jean walked to the door and opened it with shaking hands. "Get out. You can see Rosie on Saturdays like before, supervised, 2 hours. But you don't get to stay here anymore pretending to be part of our family. You don't get to play house while you're deciding whether my daughter is worth more than $8 billion. Jean, please let me explain. Rosie's birthday is in 30 days. If you take that Shanghai deal, you'll miss it, just like you missed the first 5, just like you'll keep missing them because that's who you are fundamentally, a man who chooses money over love every single time. Now get out of my home." Jack left without another word. Jean closed the door behind him and slid down against it, sobbing harder than she had since the day she'd accepted that he was never coming back the first time. In Rosie's bedroom, that drawing of their family was still taped to the wall above her bed. Jean walked in carefully and tore it down with hands that wanted to destroy something. She threw it in the trash and stood there shaking, wondering how she was going to explain to her daughter that dreams don't always come true, no matter how hard you wish for them. Chapter 9. The Impossible Choice. Jack disappeared for 3 days after Jean kicked him out, vanishing completely like he'd done 6 years ago, and Jean told herself she wasn't surprised, wasn't devastated, wasn't proven right about every fear she'd ever had. His phone went straight to voicemail every time she called to arrange Saturday visitation. His hotel said he'd checked out with no forwarding information. Keisha tried reaching him through his lawyers, who claimed they hadn't heard from him either. Nothing. Complete silence that felt like history repeating itself. Jean told herself she didn't care, that this proved she'd been right all along about who he was underneath the apologies. Told herself he was going to take the Shanghai deal and abandon them again for money. But Rosie noticed immediately, with the devastating perceptiveness of children who see too much. "Where's Daddy? He had to go away for work. Is he coming back?" Jean couldn't answer that question honestly without breaking her daughter's heart, so she just held Rosie and tried not to cry while her daughter sobbed into her shoulder. On day 4, Jack showed up at Jean's hospital unannounced. She refused to see him through her assistant. He left an envelope with her name on it in careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the Shanghai contract, rejected, signed, notarized with official stamps. Jean crumpled it up and threw it across her office with force that surprised her. Paper meant nothing. He'd signed documents before and walked away. Words on paper didn't prove commitment or character or change. On day 5, Jack appeared at Rosie's school pickup standing beside Jean's car. Jean had security remove him immediately. He didn't fight. Just looked at Jean through the car window with desperate eyes and said, "I'm not leaving. Ever. I'm staying forever." Jean drove away without responding, her hands shaking on the wheel. On day 6, the day before Rosie's birthday, Jean received an emergency call at the hospital that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. There had been an accident at VisionNet's headquarters building, a structural collapse during renovation work, multiple people trapped in the rubble. Jean was head of trauma surgery. She had to respond regardless of her personal feelings. When she arrived at the scene with her trauma team, firefighters were pulling people from the rubble with controlled urgency. Dust filled the air, sirens screamed, and then she saw them bringing out someone on a stretcher, covered in dust and blood and concrete debris. Jack. Jean's training took over, overriding every personal emotion. She ran to the stretcher, assessing injuries with the clinical precision that had saved hundreds of lives over her career. Internal bleeding evident from abdominal distension, possible spinal damage from the mechanism of injury, consciousness fading rapidly, critical condition. "What happened?" she demanded from the first responder, while her hands moved automatically checking vitals. "He was in the building for a meeting with the board. Witnesses say he was burning papers when the ceiling started collapsing, refused to leave until he'd destroyed every copy." "Burning papers?" A firefighter approached with evidence bags containing charred remains. "We found what's left of them, contracts, multiple copies, all intentionally burned. Someone said he was screaming at the other executives that he was done, that he'd rather die than sign them, and then the building started coming down." Jean felt the world tilt sideways. She looked at Jack, who was barely conscious, his eyes unfocused but searching for something or someone. "Jean?" His voice was barely a whisper, wet with blood. "I'm here. Don't try to talk. We need to get you to surgery immediately." Had to make it real. Had to destroy them completely, all of them. He was struggling to stay conscious, fighting against the darkness. "Victor tried to stop me. I told him to go to hell. Told him I'd rather die poor than live rich without her, without you, without Rosie. Stop talking. Save your strength for surgery. 8 billion. Burned it. In front of the entire board. 40 witnesses. Can't take it back now. Can't ever take that deal. Can't ever leave. Made it impossible." Jean's hands were shaking as she worked, trying to stabilize him for transport. "You destroyed the contracts? All of them? Every copy. Irreversible. Victor said I'd never work in tech again. Said he'd blacklist me everywhere. I don't care. Only have 200 million left. That's enough. That's everything. Just need you to believe I'm staying. That I'm different now." The ambulance arrived. Jean climbed in with him despite protocol, her training warring with her emotions in ways that made her feel like she was splitting apart. She'd operated under pressure thousands of times, but never on someone who just burned $8 billion because he loved her and their daughter. The surgery took 6 hours of meticulous work. Internal injuries were severe and complicated. Jean let her colleagues handle it while she stood in the observation room, watching them save his life and trying to process what he'd done. He destroyed the contracts, publicly, violently, in front of dozens of witnesses who could testify to his intentions, made it impossible to ever accept that deal or any similar offer. He'd chosen them, finally, completely, irreversibly, burned his entire future in the tech industry for a chance to be Rosie's father. When Jack woke up 2 days later in recovery with tubes and monitors surrounding him, Jean was sitting beside his bed like a vigil. "You're an idiot," she said quietly, her voice rough from lack of sleep. "I know. You nearly died in that building." "I know. You destroyed $8 billion. Best decision I ever made in my entire life." Jean's eyes filled with tears she didn't want to shed. "Why would you do that?" "Because you were right about everything. Paper doesn't mean anything. Words don't mean anything. I needed to make it impossible to ever be that person again. The person who chooses money over love. The person who walks away when things get hard. I burned that person in those contracts. He's gone. Dead. This is who I am now. Someone with no other options. Someone who can't leave even if he wanted to. Because this is my home. You and Rosie. My only home. You could have just rejected the offer in writing. You wouldn't have believed me. You said it yourself. You needed proof. Action, not words. So I gave you irreversible action. Jean wiped her eyes angrily. You're still an idiot for almost dying. Probably. But I'm an idiot who's staying. Forever. Until you're tired of me. Until Rosie doesn't need me anymore. Until I physically can't show up. The news broke that evening across every business channel. Jack Nicholson destroys $8 billion contract in dramatic office confrontation, nearly dies in building collapse. The business world went completely insane. Articles calling him reckless, analysts questioning his mental state and competency, his former board members threatening legal action for breach of fiduciary duty. But Rosie, who Jean had been protecting from all of this chaos, just wanted to know one thing when Jean finally told her. Is Daddy going to be okay? Jean took her daughter to the hospital that evening, let Rosie see Jack in his hospital bed, bruised and broken but alive and reaching for her. Rosie climbed carefully onto the bed beside him, mindful of his injuries. You missed my birthday party. Jack's face crumpled with genuine anguish. I know. I'm so sorry, baby. But you're here now. That's better than any party. I'll never miss another birthday. I promise you that. You said that before, though. Jack took Rosie's small hand in his carefully. I know I did, but this time I made it so I can't break the promise even if I wanted to. I burned everything that could take me away from you. I have nowhere else to go. This is my home, you and Mommy, forever. Rosie studied him with those two perceptive eyes. Then she said, Okay, but you have to share your hospital jello with me because you missed my cake. Jack laughed through his tears. Deal. Best deal I've ever made. Jean watched from the doorway while Keisha stood beside her with knowing eyes. He burned $8 billion for you, Keisha said softly with something like awe. He burned it for Rosie. No, he burned it for both of you, for the family he wants to build. Jean didn't respond immediately, because the truth was more complicated than Keisha understood. He'd burned it for the person he wanted to be, for the future he'd almost lost twice through cowardice. And as she watched her daughter share jello with her father in a hospital room filled with monitors and the steady beep of machines, she realized she was starting to believe he might actually stay this time. Starting to believe that maybe, possibly, some people could change when the cost of not changing became unbearable. Chapter 10. The Earned Reunion. Jack's recovery took months of painful work, physical therapy that made him cry, reconstructive surgery on his spine that the doctors said was touch and go, learning to walk without constant pain again, retraining his body to do basic things. Jean let him recover at her apartment, not because she forgave him, but because Rosie asked with eyes that made refusing impossible, and Jean was learning that sometimes love meant letting people in even when they'd proven they could destroy you. Jack slept on the couch that was too small for his frame, helped with Rosie's homework from a wheelchair at first, then with a walker, made breakfast while Jean got ready for work, slowly integrated himself into their routine like he'd always been there, like he belonged. But Jean kept her distance emotionally, watched, waited for him to fail, for the cracks to show, for the moment when things got hard and he walked away like he had before. It never came. 6 months after the accident, Jack was walking again with only occasional pain, working from home as a consultant, making a fraction of what he'd made before. He didn't complain, just showed up every day, made dinner, helped Rosie with her reading, attended school events where other parents whispered and stared, existed in their space like he'd finally figured out that showing up was the only thing that truly mattered. Jean's colleagues at the hospital asked her about him constantly, about them, about their relationship status. She never knew what to say. They weren't together, they weren't a couple, but they were something that didn't have a name yet, in any language she knew. One evening, after Rosie was asleep, Jack found Jean on the couch, staring at her medical journals, but not really reading them, her mind elsewhere. "Can I sit?" Jean gestured to the chair across from her. Jack sat down carefully, his spine still healing, his movements measured and deliberate. "I don't forgive you yet," Jean said without preamble, needing him to understand. "Maybe I never will fully. What you did destroyed something in me, made me harder, colder, more afraid of trusting anyone. I know that. I see it every day. But I'm starting to trust you, and that's harder than forgiveness, scarier than forgiveness." Jack leaned forward carefully. "I'll earn it, every day, for the rest of my life, however long it takes. You destroyed your entire career for us. No, I destroyed the person I was. The career was just part of him. I don't want to be that person ever again. I want to be someone Rosie can be proud of." John looked at him then with eyes that had seen too much pain. Really looked at him. He'd aged in these months. Grey at his temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But there was something else too. Something solid, permanent, real. "Rosie asked me today if you were staying forever. She said her friend Emma's dad left and never came back. She wanted to know if you were like Emma's dad." Jack's expression cracked with emotion. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know. That only you could answer that question with your actions, not your words. I'm staying, forever, until Rosie is tired of me, until you tell me to leave, until I physically can't show up anymore. And even then, I'll find a way." Jean felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, just enough to let a tiny bit of light in through the cracks. "You make that promise easily now. But what happens when it's not romantic anymore? When it's bills and exhaustion and Rosie having meltdowns and me being too tired to be anything other than functional? Then I'll pay bills and be exhausted with you and handle meltdowns and love you anyway, in whatever way you'll let me." The words hung in the air. Jeanne wanted to reject them, wanted to protect herself from the vulnerability of believing them. But she was tired of being afraid, tired of holding on to pain like it was armor. "I'm not ready for us to be together. Not as a couple. Maybe not ever. Too much has happened. Too much hurt that can't be erased. I understand completely. But you can stay. In the guest room. As Rosie's father. As someone who's proving every day that he's different. Can you live with that? With maybe never having more?" Jack nodded without hesitation. "I'll live with whatever you're willing to give me. Because being here, being part of Rosie's life, being near you even if we're never together romantically, is more than I deserve." Jean allowed herself to lean back against the couch, not toward him, but not away either. Somewhere in between, somewhere fragile and imperfect and real. This is going to be hard. Everything worth having is hard. They sat in silence for a long time, not touching, not together, but not separate anymore either. 3 months later, John came home from a late shift to find Jack and Rosie asleep on the couch. They'd been reading, and both had fallen asleep mid-chapter. Rosie was curled against Jack's side. His arm was around her protectively, even in sleep. John stood in the doorway watching them, her daughter and her daughter's father, her family, whether she'd planned it or not. Jack stirred, his eyes opening. He saw John watching and carefully shifted so he could look at her without waking Rosie. "Bad shift? Long shift. Lost a patient. Young. Senseless accident that could have been prevented." Jack's expression filled with understanding and sympathy. "I'm sorry." Jean walked over and sat on the edge of the couch, not close enough to touch, but closer than she'd been in months. "Thank you for being here, for showing up, for proving me wrong about who you could become." Jack reached out slowly, gave her time to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand, just held it. Nothing more. "Thank you for letting me stay, for giving me a chance I didn't earn, for being strong enough to trust again even though I gave you every reason not to." Jean looked down at their hands, his covering hers, warm, steady, present. I'm still scared you'll leave. I know. I'll spend the rest of my life proving you don't have to be scared anymore. Rosie stirred between them, her eyes opening sleepily. She saw them holding hands and smiled. Are you guys friends now? Jean looked at Jack. He looked back at her. And for the first time in 6 years, she saw something in his eyes that made her believe in possibilities again. Yeah, Jean said softly. I think we're getting there. Rosie grinned and snuggled back between them. Good. I was tired of you being mad at each other. Jack laughed quietly. Jean found herself almost smiling. And there, on her worn couch with her daughter between them and their hands still touching, she felt something she hadn't felt since the day Jack walked out of her life 6 years ago. Hope. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not a fairy tale ending with everything magically fixed. Just hope that maybe, possibly, with enough time and enough work and enough showing up, they might build something real from the ruins of what they'd destroyed. Jean didn't let go of his hand, Jack didn't pull away, and Rosie fell back asleep knowing that both her parents were there. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete. They weren't healed, but they were healing. Together, imperfectly, with all their scars visible and all their history acknowledged. And that, Jean thought, was more honest than any happy ending could ever be.